Okay, so here in this mini lesson, to kind of go back here, so our objectives here: explain the foreign policy approaches of the Bush administrations in Southeast Asia, and explain the outcomes and larger significances of the following conflicts: the Gulf War, 9/11, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Okay, so how do events have unintended and long-lasting consequences? We're definitely going to be looking at 9/11 from like a really large macro perspective. Okay, and then how does country building work, and does it? And this is kind of an issue that the United States is still dealing with today. Okay, I'm going to toss my face over here so we can carry on. So after the events of the Gulf War, okay, this is where I really want to take a moment and kind of frame for you kind of what the world is like for the U.S. and the Middle East, kind of like after the Cold War ends, and really kind of putting 9/11 and Iraq, the U.S. invading, I guess, and getting attacked on those days, kind of in the context of a larger picture. Okay, so after the events of the Gulf War, which hopefully now you've looked at, okay, and again, we're in the post-Cold War world, right? The U.S. Did a whole bunch of things that are really, really significant, okay? So number one, it kept troops permanently stationed in Saudi Arabia, okay, and it is if you don't know much about Islam, Saudi Arabia has two of the holiest cities in Islam in it, okay, and that is Mecca and Medina. Okay. And also it continues to keep supporting the nation of Israel. Okay, and if you don't know much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you probably should go learn more about that. But that is a very controversial thing that the United States is doing there. Okay, so Israel fought several wars against Arab allies and controlled Jerusalem, which was the third holiest city in Islam. Okay, now all these things kind of like, so that U.S. stations being, U.S. troops, being stationed in the Holy Land, combined with kind of that anger and resentment built up from support of Israel, really angers a whole bunch of people, and especially one guy in particular, and that is Osama bin Laden. Okay, he is a wealthy young Saudi. Okay, so again, like something to note here, Osama bin Laden is not like an he's not an Afghani or a Pakistani. He's a Saudi Arabian, okay, and he's also wealthy. He wasn't poor. Now, he does actually get exiled by the Saudi government, and the reason for that is kind of complicated. He was a military kind of construction contractor, and then he goes off and does he gets involved in really a whole bunch of things that kind of gets the Saudi government, I guess we should say maybe disfavoringly not looking at him very well, okay? And so he then goes off to set up a small terrorist network called Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to oppose what he sees as U.S. imperialism, okay? And if you're wondering why Afghanistan is the reason why bin Laden picks there, it's because is the area that bin Laden picks. It's because it has a pretty relatively weak government, and the government that's there, called the Taliban, gives basically bin Laden permission to begin training his followers, and then also just to kind of like basically ignore them. Okay, it gives them kind of a safe harbor to do what they want. So this is kind of the big point here. 9/11, which some of you, I think, for current students, either you were like just born when it happened, or you were born after it happened, therefore should not be looked at as a random or freak event, okay? These frustrations built up over a lot of time, and it's because, generally speaking, a very complicated kind of concoction of U.S. policies and then other kind of world historical events that have happened in the Middle East, okay? 9/11, if you don't know what it is, okay, it's a whole series of attacks that happen in the United States on September 11th of 2001. New York, D.C., and then elsewhere there were plans for a third plane a fourth plane to hit. But the reason why this really was such a traumatic experience, I think, for a lot of Americans, is that it caught the United States by such a remarkable level of vulnerability and then surprise. The fact that the United States could be brought to its knees in less than basically a period of 3 to 4 hours, in terms of like, the Pentagon being hit by a plane, possibly another one being sent towards the White House, although passengers managed to retake that plane and down it, and then the 2 World Trade Center buildings being downed. that was just a remarkably shocking event that happened. And it's really, really difficult for me to kind of explain to you guys because I actually was alive during when 9/11 happened, just the amount of shock and anger that there was when it occurred. Now, there's something to note here. There are, of course, the 9/11 conspiracy theories. There are please note, use your critical thinking brain. There are no scientific claims right now to support that the U.S. was involved or that that Bush did 9/11. There's nothing of that nature. So, and again, I think we have to be really careful with these kind of conspiracy theories because that does a huge disservice to like all the thousands of people that died either throwing themselves out of the towers or like firefighters attempting to go up the building and save them. So I think conspiracy theories do those people like a real disservice. But again, you're entitled, I suppose, to your own opinion if you want to dwell on those kind of things. Okay, 9/11 to Afghanistan. So how we get to that point is then the U.S., supported by its allies, obviously is going to go after bin Laden, and they do. And he's eventually hunted down and killed in 2011. Okay, and that's a pretty dramatic moment. You should go and look up the Obama press moment when he announces that that's happened. Okay, now this is where things now start to get a little bit more complicated. That the U.S. sets up a democratic government under the direction of that guy right there. His name is Hamid Karzai. He's no longer in charge. Okay, but Hamid Karzai and kind of the U.S. government that's there early on is known to be supportive of the U.S. generally speaking, but it's also extremely corrupt. And this is kind of the problem. Is that like whenever you go and try to build a government somewhere, or build a new kind of power structure that hasn't existed, sometimes it doesn't feel like you're exactly creating like a carbon copy of things. To create democracy and those kind of things is a really, really complicated process. And so to this day, Afghanistan still struggles with notions of democracy, and kind of power and equity and fairness, and especially with things like ISIS has even further complicated that. Okay, but yes, please be aware that to this day, the U.S. supports the Afghan government with huge amounts of economic and military aid, and we still have advisors over there to kind of assist them in that role. Okay, as of at least May 2018. Okay, so let's talk about then philosophically what's going on. Okay, so after 9/11, and Afghanistan is not exactly a good example of this because it's more reactive. Then President Bush will establish what is called the Bush Doctrine. Okay, and it's kind of like the Truman Doctrine or something of that nature, where it's kind of like it's their main philosophy that guides their foreign policy. And basically, here's what it is: we're going to get them before they get us. And it's really, I cannot underscore to you guys enough how palpable the sense of anger was after 9/11. And the U.S. was, what I remember feeling very much is that it was like a caged tiger that like anytime somebody got near it, it just lashed out. And again, this is kind of a difficult thing for some of you maybe to understand this because you were so young at the time. And as it says, you're generally willing to lash out anything that could be considered a threat. Okay, so what starts to happen is that the Bush administration starts to pay attention to, I guess, its former, adversary, Iraq, okay, and begins to start to put out information that the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, is in possession of what are called WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. Okay, so basically what the United States does here, now translating kind of into the Iraq War in 2004, okay, is that President Bush will call on Saddam to remove weapons, give up power, and the most shocking thing that eventually comes out is that after the invasion of Iraq in 2004, which we'll get to here in a second, okay, is that there were no evidence of WMDs found, okay, which was a really, really difficult thing for a lot of Americans to realize. But I think kind of what it speaks to is that the level of fear and anger that Americans had after 9/11, and the feeling that they needed to punish somebody. Somebody was going to pay, and maybe Saddam was an example of that. Okay, now, so how is this exactly going to happen? It's called Operation Iraqi Freedom. Okay, so George W. Bush actually tries to do the same thing that his dad did in Desert Storm. He tries to form a coalition force. Okay, to involve other countries. It's not nearly as successful as the first time. The U.S. does attract a few countries in particular that will help it, Britain being really the main one. France will definitely say no and really not support the U.S. in that. German troops and a few others. So the U.S. does invade Iraq in 2003, excuse me, I've been saying 2004, and it topples Saddam from power. And it does attempt, and still to this day, Iraq, just kind of like Afghanistan, has kind of a Western-inspired capitalist democracy. The thing that makes, I guess, Iraq a little bit more complicated than Afghanistan is the resistance that happens afterwards. There was a robust insurgency that really resisted the United States. And in the Philippines and Vietnam, the U.S., again, kind of face this difficult question of how do you negotiate with insurgent warfare? Like, not only how do you attack against it, but then how do you make peace with it too? Which is, again, really, really complicated questions. And so the U.S. today will still deal, because we do still have forces in Iraq, dealing with ISIS and kind of wrapping that issue up now that that's kind of been resolved. Are civilians involved or innocent? How do you get civilians, people who are maybe ISIS sympathizers or have been on your side, but you're still using force? And then kind of this more fundamental question, can we install democracy? Is it something that's plug and play, or is it something that's kind of developed over many years? Okay, so go ahead and answer these two these two questions for your exit ticket. Okay, and once you've done that, okay, please use the remaining time to work on your Hip Hop Revolution projects. Okay, but until I see you guys for our last class, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.